We have inundated, especially young men.
Yeah.
Go seek freedom. Go do what you want, how you want to do it, when you want to do it, which is fine. There's nothing inherently wrong to that when you're young. But if you really want meaning, if you want satisfaction, if you want direction, it's the stuff that has consequence. It's family, it's work. That's exactly right.
Freedom is.
But we're not teaching young men that.
No.
Intentionally. That's the other thing I wanted to get to, but go ahead.
Right.
I think it's intentional.
Well, I think it is too, because it's part and parcel of the idea that the productive activity of young men, and this also goes for the masculine, symbolically masculine activity of young women, by the way, but the productive activity of young men is indistinguishable from the force that gives rise to the crushing tyranny of the patriarchy. It's like, well, and that also gives young men a moral excuse not to engage in life. It's like, well, productive activity is for fools. I see it all the time.
I've been told I'm a horrible person my whole life. What use is this to me? I'm going to go play video games in my basement.
Yeah, well, and it gives an excuse to the useless part of men that don't want to succeed, because it's easy to sit around. I mean, it isn't, because the long-term consequences of that are just absolutely devastating.
Yes.
But see, so when we have a discussion about freedom, we might also say, well, the freedom is, I think this is right, it's freedom to pick your poison. It's freedom to pick your responsibility.
That's correct.
And you might say, well, there's a set of weights in front of you that you have to pick up in order to stand yourself. Because that's the other thing I think about human beings. Well, conscientiousness is a trait, and we don't have an animal model for conscientiousness. In fact, we don't understand conscientiousness at all from a psychological perspective.
Or Darwinian perspective.
Well, that's more complicated, because conscientious men tend to do better, and so they're going to be more successful. But we don't have a model for what conscientiousness is. But conscientiousness is, at least in part, the necessity to carry a load for yourself and for other people, or to suffer guilt and shame as a consequence. And so that seems built in, especially to conscientious people. Now, conscientious people tend to be more conservative, because that's one of the predictors of conservatism. But it could easily be that freedom is the freedom to choose your yoke, let's say. And then you choose the weight that you have to carry, so that you can justify your miserable existence to yourself, so that you can go to bed at the end of the night and you can think, look, I did what I needed to do to set things right today, and I don't have to carry the existential weight around of my failure and uselessness as a consequence. The existential psychologists in the 1950s who emerged out of the chaos of World War II were very much concentrated on the idea of existential guilt, that you owed being a ransom for your existence, and the way that you paid that ransom was to work for the betterment of being. I mean, it's a very ancient idea, but it is the one idea, I think, that gives people the self-respect, not self-esteem, the self-respect that's necessary to carry them through terrible times.
When I'm asked, well, what has Jordan Peterson done for your members, people you know, I say, he has them to stop acting like Peter Pan. So that they can actually be a man and not a boy.
Well, the Peter Pan story is a really interesting one, because Peter Pan means everything, right? Technically, that's what Pan means. And Peter Pan wants to be a child because a child can be anything, can be everything, right? So what you have in childhood is that a plethora of potential. And the problem with growing up is that you have to sacrifice that pan potential for a defined actuality, right? That's to grow up and become something instead of staying potentially anything. Now, the problem with Peter Pan is that he looks into the world and sees Captain Hook as his role model, right? And so that's his model for adulthood. And Hook is terrified of death. That's the crocodile that's chasing him with the clock in his stomach. And the crocodile already has a piece of him. It's got a taste of him. And so Hook is constantly chased by the dragon of chaos, essentially, that's already got a taste of him. And because Hook is terrified of his own mortality and terrified in general, he's a tyrant. And so Pan looks at Hook and says, well, if that's adulthood, I'd rather stay king of the lost boys.
That's exactly
right. And so, yeah, and it's a very powerful story, well, which is why people still tell it.
What's one piece of advice that you would have given your 16-year-old self?
Don't be so high and mighty that you don't take advantage of the humble opportunities that are granted to you. When I look back, I didn't like school at all. You might say I hated it. And I've thought a lot about that, because I thought, well, there were reasons. I was a very fast reader. I could get through the books that were given to us in English class, generally in the first day. And that wasn't really appreciated, I would say. But there were things, and I was bored a lot as a teenager and got into a reasonable amount of trouble, not an unreasonable amount, but then, there were sports teams and there were attempts to organize plays, and there were things that I didn't do that I could have, that would have made my life better. But I was too cynical, maybe, to take full advantage of them. And I did work when I was a kid. I worked in restaurants as a dishwasher, short order cook, that sort of thing. That was a really good decision. I think my fondest memories in some ways of my adolescence are memories of working in the restaurant. But don't, life is very difficult. And in order to thrive with this difficult life, if an opportunity is presented to you, you shouldn't be so arrogant that you dismiss it. And it's really easy to be arrogant as a teenager, especially if you're smart, because you think, well, I'm smarter than everybody else. It's like, actually, no. There's lots of people that are a lot smarter than you. You just haven't met them yet. And you're not as smart as you think you are, besides, and other people aren't as dumb as you think they are either.
There's different kinds of smart.
There certainly is. Yes, and wise beats smart. So I would say if you're 16 and your life isn't so happy, it's like, look around and see if there are opportunities that people are granting you, even imperfect opportunities, because they're going to be imperfect, that you could exploit, let's say, in the proper way and learn and grow. I had this teacher, Ada Paul. She's dead now. I really liked her in grade 4. She was an organist at the church. And when I was 14, 15, she offered to teach me how to play the organ. I, for a variety of reasons, wasn't really that into the idea. And so I kind of went, and then a couple of times I skipped it, and it just sort of fell apart, and which was pretty rude of me, obviously, because she went out of her way to offer this. And that's a good example, because it wasn't cool to play the organ. It wasn't cool to do I don't know what it was like when you grew up. When I grew up, it wasn't cool to do anything. She was a great teacher. I really liked Ada Paul. She was, and I betrayed her trust, It's like, that wasn't very bright.
I think we all have memories like that as kids,
Yeah.
But I think that advice is good to even young adults, even to adults, really, to pause and appreciate the opportunities and the doors that are always open to them.
Well,
the experiences that are always available.
Well, here's an idea.
Yeah.
So life is brutal. And what you have to set against that is possibility. And you might say, well, life is so brutal that you have to utilize all the possibility that comes your way. So an opportunity manifests itself and you turn it down. You ignore it, you let it drift away. It's like, that's one thing that you had against the horror of existence that you let go of. You let go of 10 of those things, man, you're on the street.
Right.
And it's no fun there. And it doesn't get better. And so there is a possibility that if you utilized all the possibility that was offered to you, that your life would be straight and clean and engaging and acceptable and positive. And that's worth finding out if that's the case, because it might be true. Find out that edge that you can push yourself against. And it's going to be different for different people. But that's the call to adventure and heroism. And there are life and death situations everywhere around you if you want to involve yourself in them. Now, sometimes that might be like to put yourself together to the degree that you can, say physically or spiritually or intellectually. It could be an intellectual battle. It could be a moral battle. Like the frontier is everywhere. The frontier is just the edge between what you know and what you don't know. You want to put yourself on that damn edge and make yourself into something. And you can retreat into comfort in the modern world. And I think that is a problem. You know, I mean, I've noticed that it's one of the pathologies of wealth, I would say, because one of the problems with being relatively wealthy if you're a parent is that you cannot provide your children with necessity. And that's a big problem because they need necessity to call them into being. And, you know, if you don't have a lot of material resources and your children ask you for something, you can say no because no is the answer. It's like, no, we can't do that. But if you can say yes, then it's really hard to say no because then you're just arbitrary. Well, I don't know. It's like Kierkegaard said, you know, there will come a time when we have so much security and comfort that what we'll want more than anything else is deprivation and challenge. And I think that's particularly what young men want. You know, we tend to think of meaning as something that people create as a secondary consequence through thinking or through philosophy or something like that. And when we think that, it's easy to criticize it. It's easy to become cynical about it. It's easy to lose faith in it. But when you understand that it actually is a much deeper phenomenon than that, and that the cognitive elements, the philosophical elements, are sort of like, well, they're like the fronds on the top of the pond on a plant system that has unbelievably deep roots that go way down into the water. It's much, there's something about that that's much firmer and more solid. And I think the evidence that meaning is an instinct, a deep, deep instinct, is overwhelming. I don't think that popular knowledge has caught up with that. I mean, the research it's not new, but it's been done, I would say, in the main in the last 30 years or so, and mostly by psychobiologists, like people who are really on the hard science end of psychology. And their work is difficult. It's technically difficult. It involves a lot of neurobiology, neuroanatomy, psychopharmacology. It's hard work. It's hard going, but it's unbelievably useful. Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Because meaning is an instinct. And meaning is the instinct that guides you in life across the totality of life, right? What's expedient, that's what you might want to do right now in an impulsive sense, right? Because you're driven forward by, anger or anxiety or frustration or disappointment or despair. Some sort of one-eyed motivational monster that's got you in its grip that really isn't considering everything at once, right? Like considering your life tomorrow or your life next week or your family's life or maybe even your well-being half an hour from now, you know, because you lash out in anger, and you can, you know, people do that. It's understandable. Sometimes it's even necessary, but it's not wise generally. And the instinct for meaning seems to be a consequence of the integration of all of those underlying motivations and emotions with social being, and then the manifestation of something like the proper pathway forward. And you need that because you need to know how to move forward in life, because you need to move forward in life. You need to act in life. And the other thing that's, I suppose, part and parcel of, let's say, 12 rules for life is the insistence upon action as of primary import. We're not fundamentally creatures who passively perceive the objective world. That's not the goal of our perceptual systems. It's not the goal of our memory. The reason that you have memories isn't to remember the past. The reason you have memories is so that if something bad happened to you in the past, you can figure out what it was that was bad, and you can figure out why it happened, and then you can not do it again in the future, right? It's very practical. And it's the same on the positive end of the spectrum. If good things happen to you in the past, then conceivably duplicating whatever you did to get those good things to happen could have them happen again in the future. So it's practical memory, and it's oriented towards action, and it's oriented towards like the quality of your life. So you need that instinct for meaning too. So, and we should get this real straight. Why do you need it? Well, you need it because life is really, really difficult, right? I mean, people have a rough time of it. There's plenty of suffering in life, and everyone is going to encounter it, right? You learn this as a clinical psychologist, and you know this generally, unless you're an extraordinarily fortunate person. You don't have to talk to someone for very long and really talk to them and get beneath the surface until you find, there's a tragedy or 2 or 3 or 10 lurking not very far beneath the surface. Someone in the family is very ill. There's a childhood history of extreme pathology, alcoholism somewhere in the family, maybe a touch of insanity. Someone has cancer. Some older relative is dying. There's financial trouble. There's economic trouble. There's marital trouble. It's like life is trouble. And now, that doesn't mean it's all trouble, but man, it's trouble. And sometimes it's a lot of trouble. And sometimes it's so much trouble that you can barely stand it. And you see that because people get depressed and they commit suicide. And the reason they do that is because they think not being is better than being. And that's quite the decision, So, and it's not that uncommon among people who are depressed. And so it's a very important thing to consider. And it isn't just a matter of depression and suicide. That's bad enough. But, if you're unhappy because your suffering has pushed you past the point of your ability to cope, then there's all sorts of other things that can happen to you that aren't directed towards you. You can become cynical, and you can become bitter, and you can become cruel, and you can become narcissistic and deceitful and arrogant. And it's like everything's for you. And then you're out for revenge. That's a nice one. I don't know against who, but maybe everyone. Maybe even including you, because you're not happy about the role you've played in generating your own misery. I mean, there's a lot of darkness underneath the suffering. And so, and that's an ever-present existential danger for human beings. We're aware of the future. We're aware of our fragility. We're aware of our mortality. It's something that makes us truly unique, truly conscious in a way that no other creature is, and capable of things that no other creature can do, but also bearing an unbelievably heavy existential load. We're the only creatures that have to always contend with the fact that we're finite and that everyone we know is in the same position, that allied with the suffering. And so that's there all the time. And even in the brightest moments, in some sense, in Renaissance paintings, in still lifes, they used to put a memento mori often in the still life, like a skull somewhere in the corner, or sometimes in a very strange perspective, so that you could only see the skull if you were standing like right beside the painting instead of dead on. But the idea was to always remember, that everything that exists is tainted or touched with the taint of mortality. And that's rough, but there's some useful things in it. It keeps you awake, and it keeps you focused if you're careful. But it also does indicate to you, if you think about it, the necessity of having a meaning in your life. It's bad enough to have something bad happen to you, and it's likely that that'll happen. But it's even worse for you to do it to yourself and to know that you did it. That's rough. And it's also extraordinarily rough to be betrayed by someone else, or tyrannized by your own culture. And that's not just suffering. That's like unnecessary and pointless suffering that's being directed at you by something that wants that to happen. And so both of those are very, very powerful, let's say, archetypal forces, suffering and malevolence, and we have to deal with them at every level of reality. And you need something to push back against that. It's not optional. I've read the accounts and the actions of people who've taken a very vicious turn into the darkest parts of the underworld, consequence of their resentment and their malevolence, and then their desire to make everything in the world suffer for the outrage of its existence, man. I mean, that's how we turn things into hell. If you want to know why totalitarian states take the brutal twists they take and why people are motivated to do the absolutely terrible things that they do, well, that's why, is that the suffering and the malevolence that's intrinsic to life overwhelms them, and they turn in a very bad direction, and then they make everything that's already bad way worse, and we're very, very inventive at such things. And so that's not good, unless that's the path you want. That's a bad idea. You need an alternative, and that's meaning. How much trouble would you want there not to be? It's a weird question, right? Because you want to have something to contend with. You want to have something that forces from you the best that you have. And so you have to have real problems. It's something like that. Would you dispense with all your real... You could just lay down on a bed and have pablum infused into your mouth, if all your problems were solved. And so maybe you want difficult problems that you can solve, something like that, because there's some... I don't know what it is about it. There's the overcoming and the growth that comes along with that. There's something about the nobility of the enterprise. You certainly see that when you go about having children, for example, which is, the psychological literature is quite clear. If you do moment-to-moment comparisons of people who have kids and people who don't have kids, the people who don't have kids are happier. And so psychologists who tend to get things wrong even when they make intelligent discoveries like that one, immediately, some of them, jump to the conclusion that because happiness is the goal, that, well, there's something about children that, make you unhappy, and that's not good. It's like, well, wait a second. Maybe that's the wrong metric. It's like, of course you're less happy once you have children because you have to worry about them. My neighbor down the street, who's a very smart woman, said to me once, you can only be as happy as your unhappiest child. And which I thought was really good, that's really smart. But then it isn't, well, if having children doesn't make you happy, the answer isn't don't have children. It's like, don't be so stupid about being happy. That's the answer. It's because there's a nobility in the pursuit, right? And of course, now you're responsible. You have a new baby, you think, especially if you're a new parent, you think, what the hell is this? And what am I going to do with it? It's like, and then you're done for the rest of your life. You never sleep properly again because you're going to be worried about this creature that you have to take care of. But like, what the hell good are you if you're not doing that, or something else equally difficult, because you just haven't been called out yet, unless you take on a responsibility like that. The idea that life is, that happiness is the purpose of life. It's like, great for happiness, man. If it comes along, you should be thrilled that it's visiting you. But the notion that that's what you should pursue, that's the weakest possible notion. First of all, as soon as something terrible happens to you, you're done. It's like, life is to be happy. It's like, well, now you have cancer. So how's that? How's the happiness thing working out for you now? Or maybe it's not you, maybe it's your father that has Alzheimer's disease or some damn thing. And, it's like, it's a rare person that doesn't have some catastrophe one person away from them. It's like, life is to be happy. That's not right. And we can at least derive that from these stories. That isn't what they say at all. God's perfectly happy in the stories to grant the people with whom he forms a covenant happiness and prosperity, but there's never a word that that's the purpose. The rule is aim high and get your bloody act together. That's the rule, and establish this contractual covenant with the ultimate ideal, and that will see you through the catastrophes. And that's a much more mature way of looking at life as far as I'm concerned, because all you have to do is have your eyes half open and you see that the fundamental reality of life is tragedy and suffering. That's inescapable. That doesn't mean that it makes life unbearable or that it makes being something that shouldn't have existed. Right? That isn't what it means. But it means that you have to contend with it and you have to get ready. And the willingness to adopt responsibility for yourself and for others is the precondition for that. And then maybe if you do that properly, then now and then you get some happiness. You can sit at the end of a day and you have half an hour where your conscience is clear and there's nothing that you need to be doing, and you can relax and think, that's all right. Things are okay, and thank God for that. And that's maybe where you get your happiness. So it's sort of predicated on the idea that life is for happiness. And I don't think that's right, and I don't think that's how people experience life, and I might be wrong, but it seems to me that people experience life as something like a series of crucial ethical decisions. It's something like that. I mean, I just can't imagine, and maybe I'm being naive about this, but I can't imagine another being that's like me in most senses, that isn't constantly wrestling in some sense with what the next proper thing to do is. It's not like it's obvious. It's not bloody obvious. And it doesn't mean you'll do the right thing, because you don't lots of times. And you know that by your own judgment, right? Because you're making mistakes all the time. Sometimes you don't know what you're doing, and maybe it's a mistake and maybe it isn't. And who's to say? But that isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you know that what you're doing is wrong and you go ahead and do it anyways. People do that all the time. And that's also extremely peculiar. You bloody well think that if you knew it was wrong and you told yourself that it was wrong, that would be sufficient, so that you just wouldn't do it. But that isn't what you're like at all, you know. And you can tell yourself something is wrong 50 times and you'll do it the 51st time, and then you'll feel, you know, like you deserve to feel, probably. But it doesn't stop you. And so then I think the other problem with the viewpoint, the idea that the suffering of life eradicates its utility, is that it's predicated on the idea that happiness, or lack of suffering even, is the right criteria by which to judge life. And I don't think that's how we actually experience life. I think what we do instead is put ourselves through a series of excruciating moral choices. You know, and one of the things that's really significant about the biblical stories, and I think about the entire implicit philosophy, you know, that's embedded in the stories, is that that's how life is presented in the stories, is all of these individuals. First, they're individuals, they're not groups. And second, they're agonizing over their moral choices all the time. And they have a relationship with God, but it's not a directive relationship exactly. Even the people to whom God speaks directly, which I suspect is not something you'd exactly want to have happen, they're still, even the fact that they have a direct relationship with God doesn't stop them from being tormented continually by their moral choices. And so the world is presented as a moral landscape, not as a place that justifies itself by happiness. It's presented as a moral landscape, and people are presented as creatures who traverse through the moral landscape, making ethical decisions that determine the course of the world. And that seems to me to be right. And that's not the same as happiness by any stretch of the imagination. It's a whole different category of being. And, you know, and then I've thought that through a lot, and I think, well, we do make choices, and what we do is contend with the future, you know. And the future seems to appear to us as a realm of possibility. That's a more accurate way of thinking about it than that the future presents itself to us as a realm of determined things. It presents itself as a realm of possibility, and there's good choices in that realm, and there's poor choices or even evil choices in that realm. And we're negotiating continually, deciding which of those choices we're going to bring into being. That seems to me to be phenomenologically indisputable, and we certainly treat each other as if that's what we're doing, because we hold each other responsible for our actions, you know, with some exceptions, and that we're deciding each moment whether to make things better or worse. There's a profound anti-human ethos, I think, that pervades our culture, you know, that considers human beings cancers on the planet, something like that, you know, and that there should be less of us. It's the same spirit that motivated the guy who wrote the book about it better to have never been. And it's like, I don't see it that way, you know. I mean, I think people do pretty well for having their leg caught in a bear trap and their head caught in a vice. They're actually doing pretty well, because life is really hard, and the fact that we're not absolutely brutal and murderous all the time is really something remarkable, given what we actually have to contend with, that we can go out of our way to be honest and generous and altruistic and to care for each other under unbelievably dire circumstances, and to act nobly sometimes under the most trying conditions. You know, in Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, he tells story after story of people who acted abysmally, but also people who, under the worst threats imaginable, never sacrificed their character. You know, and reading about that is really, well, it really makes you wonder. That's what it does. Perception is very, very tightly related to action, to movement forward, and to emotion. And those things are very important to know. They're very tightly associated. So, for example, you live in a map, let's say, or a story, and the story is wherever I am isn't as good as it could be, and so I'm going to go somewhere that's somewhat better. And, you know, that can be of different time frames. Maybe you've got a plan for the next minute. You know, you're hungry, and so you want to go somewhere to eat, or maybe it could be for the next hour, or the next week, or the next day, or the next year, or whatever. But basically what you're trying to do is take where you are, point A, and make it better, point B. And so you're always somewhere that isn't quite as good as it should be, and you're always going somewhere that's somewhat better. At least that's the hope. Unless things have gone wrong, you know, and you feel, God, it's nothing but downhill from here on in. And that's not good. You don't want that. That's a pathological condition. So, and it's kind of unfortunate in some sense, because it means you can't be satisfied with what you've got. But how the hell can you be satisfied with what you've got? Because you've got problems coming your way. You know, I mean, even if everything's okay right now, which it probably isn't, but even if it was, that doesn't mean everything's going to be okay tomorrow or next week or next year or 5 years from now, right? You've got the future to take care of, and your future self, and you've got your family to take care of, and maybe you've got your community to take care of. So you've got some problems. And so the way things are isn't good enough. And so you're going to fix them a bit. And so then you fix them across different levels of resolution. And you do this, you do this technically in this manner. So you identify where you are. One thing you might think about is if you're mixed up, one of the problems you might have is that you don't know where you are. Lots of times people have to go to therapy or talk for a long time to someone to find out where they are, because your experience might have scattered you everywhere, and you feel that you've come apart at the seams, right? That things have fallen apart around you, that you're in chaos. You don't know where you are, and so then you're in trouble, because how the hell are you going to plot a course forward into the future if you don't know where you are? And so maybe you have to bring yourself up to date. I have an exercise online, by the way, at a place called Self-Authoring, which is called the Past Authoring Exercise, fittingly enough. And what it asks you to do is to write an autobiography. It's a guided autobiography, and it can kind of bring you up to date. And you can know if you need to be brought up to date. It's fairly straightforward. If you're obsessed by memories of the past, more than 18 months old, and most of those are negative, so anxiety-provoking most often, then there's a lot of you that's stuck in the past. And what that means is you didn't map the territory well enough, and the parts of your brain that are alarm systems, anxiety systems, are saying, no, there's holes in the way you're looking at the world. There's holes in the way that you're looking in the world. And you fell in them once, and you don't know where they are, and you don't know how to fill them, and you don't know how to walk around them, and so you can't forget them, you can't forget them, you can't forget them, you can't forget them. So you have recurring nightmares, for example, are a good example of that sort of thing happening. But in any case, if you have memories like that, you remember them, they make you feel anxious and negative, you're stuck back there. Your body is still reacting as if there's an emergency that could happen again that you haven't fixed. And it doesn't matter if it was your fault. That's irrelevant, because the alarm system doesn't care. Like, when your smoke detector goes off, it isn't relevant whether it was your fault. The smoke detector just says, house is on fire. And that's a bad thing. And your anxiety systems are like that. If they're tagging old memories with anxiety, then you have to do something about it, or you will be tortured by those memories forever, because that's how the alarm system works. And so maybe you need to go back there and clean things up. You got to figure out, okay, well, how did this happen? What sort of role did I play? Even if it's a minor role, that doesn't matter, because the point is that you don't want to be put in the same vulnerable position again. So anything you can do to strengthen yourself is good. and often if it's a really old memory, like maybe you were a child, you're not a child now, so you probably have a variety of techniques at hand that you could use to deal with a situation like that if it came up now. And so you have to update that part of your brain that still thinks you're 4. You need to know where you are. So let's say where you are is, well, you're on this stage, and you're on this side of the stage, and you decide that you're going to go over to that side of the stage, just to show that you can. And you're making the decision, the same decision that, the famous chicken who is going to cross the road. Why does the chicken cross the road? Well, if it's a sensible chicken, it's because it assumes that there's something better on the other side of the road. It's like, or maybe it's random curiosity, but then it just gets picked off by a dingo or a coyote, so that's not so good. The other side of the road is better, so away the chicken goes. So that's what you're doing. You're going somewhere slightly better. And so that's good. Technically, it's good. Because the way that your positive emotion systems work, they run on a neurochemical called dopamine, which, by the way, is the neurochemical system that drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine and alcohol for some people and opiates affect dramatically and make people feel far better than they should, which is part of their danger. It's a very fundamental system. The dopamine system kicks in with a kick of positive emotion if you're going somewhere that's worth going. And so that's worth knowing. It's really worth knowing. It's like, okay, you want a little bit of positivity in your life. Well, how do you get it? Well, you got to get the system. It's almost it's the left hemisphere system for most people. Not that that's particularly relevant, but it is a standalone neurochemical system. It's rooted very, very deeply in the brain's exploratory circuitry. So very ancient system. And it's happy when you have somewhere to go. That's the first thing. And then it's also happy when you're going there. And so if I'm on this side of the stage and I want to go over to that side of the stage and I see that there's a nice clear pathway, I could just go straight down this line, then I look at that and I'm actually a little happy. I'm not ecstatic. I mean, who the hell cares if I get to the other side of the stage, right? I mean, it's a small piece of my life, but it's not nothing. It's something. Okay, and so I look at the pathway, and I think that's a good pathway, and I feel a little positive. And then if I move here, and then I see that little table right in the way between me and the other side of the stage, then I feel a little negative, because I don't want an obstacle in my pathway. And so that's really how you're looking at the world, by the way. You don't see objects. It's not the right way to think about it. We don't see objects, and then think about them, and then evaluate them, and then decide how to act on them. Or if we do it rarely and slowly and with a lot of thought. What we see instead are pathways with tools that will move us forward, or obstacles, right? And there's no obstacles here, and there's a nice flat road, and so great. Positive emotion. This is a task I can undertake. The sailing is clear. It's a good day. And then I'm here, and it's like, yeah, well, that's a little annoying. I get a little pang of disappointment, let's say, anxiety. Can I make it around that obstacle? I'm fairly confident. I've done this sort of thing before. So I can take the rough route, and I can, walk forward like this, and then I can do this great trick, which is just this, and then, I've circumvented the obstacle. Now, if I didn't know how to do the little bit of circumvention, then that would be a real problem, right? Because I couldn't get from point A to B, and that would screw up my plan. But I do have that particular skill set, so it's a minor disruption to the perceptual set that I'm using to organize the world. It's a minor bit of chaos, because that's what happens when your perceptual set, the structure that you're using to organize the world, the plan through which you're viewing the complexity of the world, reveals an inadequacy. Then that destabilizes your emotions. So that's another thing to know. One thing you need to know is you need to be going somewhere, and there needs to be a pathway in order for you to feel good. The other thing to know is that if that plan is untenable or becomes destabilized, then what happens is you become flooded with negative emotion. Frustration, disappointment, anger, primarily anxiety. But all of those things sort of intermingled. Anger maybe because you have to fight your way through the obstacle. Frustration because maybe you have to make a new plan. Disappointment because you put a bunch of work into the damn plan and it didn't work out. Anxiety, because now there's too many choices in front of you. And so people don't like to have their plans disrupted. They don't like to have their plans disrupted. And the reason for that is that their plans are directly associated with their emotional perception of the world. It's easy to become bitter about life and to become angry because, of course, life is difficult and it's full of disappointments. And people are also subject to betrayal on the part of themselves and on the part of people that hypothetically care for them. And so it's easy to get bitter and to be resentful. And resentment is a very useful emotion, even though I think it's one of the most damaging emotions if it's not dealt with properly. So if you're resentful, it basically means only one of two things. It either means you should grow up and quit whining and get on with your life, or it means that you're being subject to tyrannical forces of one form or another, maybe emanating from you, maybe a consequence of the natural environment, maybe a consequence of society. You're being subject to tyrannical forces and you're not putting your own best interests forward, like in that broader sense that I described. And I don't mean your selfish, narrow interests that only serve the purposes of instantaneous gratification. I mean your own best interests in terms of developing your character over the span of your life. If you're resentful, it either means that you're immature and that you should grow the hell up. And so you need to figure out how much of your resentment is that, and maybe allied with the desire to find other things or people to blame. But the other possible option is that you have something to say or do, right? Because you're in a situation where you're violating your own internal ethical standards and you're being required, pressured, let's say things you don't believe or to do things that you believe to be wrong. And you need to determine, you need to start to strategize and plan how you can rectify that so that you can say what you mean. Like if you're negotiating with a marital partner, for example, and there are issues in your marriage that aren't making you happy, well, the first thing is you have to take note of that, right? To see that you're actually unhappy. The second is that you have to be willing to engage in a certain amount of conflict, because in order to sort out what's disturbing you, you're going to have to lay your concerns out on the table and say, well, look, this is bothering me. You don't have to say, well, I'm right and you're wrong and you have to fix this. You have to say, well, I've noticed that this pattern of interaction or lack of interaction, say, in our relationship is making me resentful and angry. And the danger of that, of course, is you're going to take it out on yourself and your partner. The danger is passive aggressiveness. You know, you're not going to respond to your partner positively when they do something good if you're resentful about them. And you're not going to respond to yourself properly. And so you have to lay it out on the table, but sort of in a spirit of ignorant humility. It's like, look, I'm frustrated. I'm feeling this way about our relationship. Here's what I think might be going wrong, maybe on my part and maybe on your part. And here's what I envision as a possible solution. That's also really necessary if you're going to say what you have to say, which is to manifest yourself properly in the world. Is you can't just complain about what's wrong. You have to think, well, what would my minimal preconditions for satisfaction be? You have to offer that to the person that you're negotiating with. And so then you learn to abide by the truth to the degree that you can do that. And no one does it perfectly, you know, but it's very useful because you're not storing up a whole sequence of memories about how you were unfairly treated and abused and betrayed. Instead, you're trying to stay on top of it and to note your unhappiness and dissatisfaction when it manifests itself, and to accept that that's the case, and then to analyze that to see if it's your problem, like I said, with regards to maturity, or if it indicates that there's an injustice in the manner in which you and the world are interacting, and then to work to set that right, even in small ways. And so it's a matter of characterological development, and that makes you stronger over time. In the future authoring program, we built this section where you have to outline your most dismal future, right? What your future would be like if you let all your bad habits and characterological weaknesses have the upper hand. And the reason we did this is because you can't straighten yourself out merely as a consequence of hope. Let's say you lay out a vision for the future and you think about what your life would be, what you'd like your life to be like. And then that makes you hopeful and it motivates you because it gives you something worthwhile and higher order to work for, right? And that's useful. That's positive emotion working for you, because positive emotion is experienced in relationship to goals. But it's not as useful as also being chased by something you're terrified by. And if you have a good sense of how you'd fall apart if you stayed weak, and just exactly what kind of hell that would be, then when you determine to do something like to tell the truth and to say what you think and to not do things that you hate, then you're going to be pulled along by the purpose that your vision has provided for you, but also pushed along by your desire to avoid the worst forms of hell that you've already outlined for yourself personally. And that can also help you be brave enough to stand up in a situation that would require conflict, because if you have something to say and you have something to negotiate about with someone, then there's going to be a certain amount of conflictual dialogue that accompanies that, right? To lay out a set of problems and to describe the fact forthrightly that those problems characterize a relationship, and then to seek for solutions, is quite stressful in the short term. And it's really easy to avoid. And so people avoid it all the time. And then they store up grievances across the span of their relationships. And eventually the grievances mount to the point where they return in monstrous form and just eat everything up. That's where you get divorces, or that's where you explode at your boss and end up fired, or that's where you develop high blood pressure over 15 years because you can't stand all the accumulated monsters in your closet, and you drink yourself into oblivion because you can't stand your life. That's all, very counterproductive. But it's easy to avoid that necessary conflict on a moment-to-moment basis because it's very stressful to speak forthrightly about genuine conflicts, especially when you're dealing with important parts of your life. But otherwise you don't straighten them out, and then you have to carry all that forward. So you need to be terrified of the consequences of not speaking your piece. And that can counterbalance the terror of actually trying to have a conversation. So, and you also have to look with regards to the shadow ideas, like you have to get in touch with the depths of your anger. Lots of people are resentful about all sorts of things. They're resentful about, women, and they're resentful about men, and they're resentful about the patriarchy, and they're resentful about the left wing, and they're resentful about the right wing, and they're resentful about politicians, and they're resentful about the cataclysmic force of nature and its ability to make people sick and suffer, and they're resentful about their own inadequacies and about their bad parenting, and God, like the list is just bloody endless, and that can make you very, very angry. That's part of that resentment. And cynical and bitter and dark and full of fantasies about destruction and the desire to bring things down and the wish that everyone else suffered and the desire to shake your fist at God. And all of that's really dark. Jung said, the human shadow extends all the way down to hell. And he really meant that, because all the terrible things that people are motivated to do are associated with that shadow domain. And none of you are saints in any likelihood. You have a terrible capacity for destructiveness. And when you start to consult your resentment and to see how angry you are, it can terrify you to see the depths of that anger. Sometimes that'll manifest itself in very destructive fantasies, which you might not want to become conscious of because they're so brutal, let's say, and so aggressive that you can't even believe that you generate them, the nice person that's you. So it's quite frightening to open that door and see all that, and that also associates you with the entire dark shadow of mankind, right? The satanic element of the human character. But it opens the door to understanding as well, to understanding how people can do terrible things, because you can see yourself as one of the people who can do terrible things. That's really useful, because then maybe you start to be motivated to be the sort of person who wouldn't do terrible things. It also is in perverse sense, it's also a discovery of your own strength, though, because, if you have that desire for aggression, that desire for destruction, and that ability to fantasize in that aggressive manner, it also means that you can incorporate some of that into your speech and into your actions, so that you're a lot more immovable, right? And a lot more of a force to contend with. It can give you some respect for yourself when you realize that you're a force of destruction as well as creation. And then you're also more likely to treat yourself with a bit more intelligent caution, to know that part of you is a ticking bomb in some sense that can go off. And so you tread a bit more lightly around yourself, and maybe you encourage people to tread a bit more lightly around you as well, which isn't such a bad thing. And all the people that I really admire, that I know, have a clearly dangerous side, and you don't want to have that activated any more than necessary. But it's also what makes them respectable and strong, especially if they have that under control. So, that's a bit of a dialogue about shadow integration. It's a very challenging undertaking, to pull in that dark side of your character. And that would be all the things that you've repressed or failed to develop as a consequence of trying to be a harmless and, let's say a harmless citizen who looks virtuous on the surface. That's the Jungian persona. And you need that, because everybody needs a mask that they wear in public, like a suit, so that we can tolerate seeing each other on the street. We don't have to look right into our depths every time we interact. We need that persona, but that has to be transcended. And the way to transcend that is to integrate the darker parts of the character.